Once again, greetings, culture lovers. Tonight is really a special treat for me, and I hope it will be for you, because my guest is somebody who is not only an old friend and associate, but one of the genuine, talented movers and shakers of our business. Roy Thomas, editor emeritus of Marvel Comics, and as good a writer as we're ever going to find anywhere in the comic business and maybe in any other business. Roy, it's really a pleasure having you tonight.
Thanks up for the build-up, except for the old part.
Well, I meant old in a figurative sense, of course. You'll always be Roy the boy to me.
Right.
How old were you when you started at Marvel, Roy?
Well, I'm informed by people in the industry I was an old man because I was pushing 25, and almost everybody else, yourself included, that I know, got in when they were teenagers.
Yeah.
But in the middle 60s, almost nobody had been getting into the field for several years, so at 24, I guess I was fairly young.
Well, you know, it's a funny thing. When you started, I have to put these on so I can see my security blanket here, okay? When you started, you looked so young because you were, as I remember, you were so innocent-eyed and so believing and trustful and everything.
It's a long time ago.
Yeah, oh, you changed. But anyhow, yeah, I remember, and you were absolutely a godsend to me because I was looking so desperately for somebody who could handle all these books and do this writing and so forth, and it just was as though you were the answer to a prayer. Remember, you took over the Fantastic Four, you took over the Avengers, the X. I guess you did almost all the stories.
Most.
And as good as anybody could have wanted, built up your own following. I began to hate you as the fans began to love you. But here we are. You know, one thing I've always wondered, Roy, when you were young, most kids, they took up stamp collecting, they got into electric trains, they read comics, and then after a year or two, they went to other things. What made you such a real devotee of comic books?
Yeah. I think that things just have to hit you at the right age. I don't know. Trains, I couldn't afford to collect trains, for one thing. I always kind of wanted to, you know, but that's a lot of money. Stamp collecting, little tiny pictures, I couldn't get interested in little tiny single shots. But when I was about 4.5 years old, or maybe a little younger, I was walking with my mother, I've traced back, through a drugstore in Jackson, Missouri, where I was born. And suddenly I looked up and saw all these colors, you know, and everything. And I said, "What's that?" And, you know, and here were all these characters, Captain America and Superman and Batman and all these great characters. And at the age of 4, before I could read them, my mother just started reading them to me. I developed a great love for them that's, you know, like totally beyond any kind of comprehension. And the other things, the stamp collecting and all the other things that I had as hobbies, be it chess or collecting records, going to movies, they just never meant as much to me as comics.
Yeah. And it's really stayed with you ever since.
Yes, unlike, say, John Romita, you know, who was mentioning last week that he gave them up for a while and renounced them. Well, there were times during the 50s when there was not much happening in comics that I really liked, but there was never a time when over a couple of weeks went by that I didn't buy a comic, whether it was, you know, the Superman and Batman, the few superheroes that were left, or it was Uncle Scrooge, or it was Mad, or it was Archie, if it had to be.
You even published a so-called fanzine of your own, of course, a fan magazine. What was it called?
Alter Ego.
Yeah, I remember that.
That's what got me into the field, basically, I guess.
And just before we get into your getting into the field, because I want to get into that, you had been a school teacher too, hadn't you, Roy?
High school.
Yeah, and what did you teach?
Well, I was supposed to teach English. I guess that's what I taught. Since my majors were history and social sciences, naturally I ended up teaching English, which was a major. It was mostly 8th, 9th, and 10th grade level in the St. Louis area for the most part, for about 4 years.
I think it may come as a surprise to some people, mostly people who've landed from the moon, who still think of comics as being a little bit further down than they really are on the cultural scale, that one of our very top people is an ex-school teacher, a high school teacher of English, and as a matter of fact, we have a number of other people.
Yes.
Let's see, who is it? We have, you had mentioned somebody just earlier.
Well, Steve Gerber,
Steve
Gerber, one of the main writers. Well, he's an old friend of mine. I've known him since he was in junior high. Yeah. And the major creator of Howard the Duck and a writer for Marvel for the last several years. He was a high school teacher, I think, of English and so forth in the St. Louis area for a few years, in addition to being in advertising and other fields.
And our new Canadian artist.
A new young Canadian artist is only 23, a guy named Jim Craig, and he's teaching, including comic book drawing, in a college in Toronto. And Marv Wolfman, who is an editor-writer there, was an art teacher for a year or two. So there's a number of people there that are teachers.
I guess we shouldn't dwell on it too much, or people are going to feel that they need a teaching license in order to come in and do Marvel Comics. You don't really have to. It does help to have some sort of an intelligence, though. And now, on that ridiculous note, let me pause for a moment, because I know Roy is desperately waiting to find out all about John Buscema's Comic Book Workshop. John, whom you know as well as I do, because you write so many of his stories, including Conan the Barbarian, and we'll devote a lot of time to that later. John is teaching artwork in the heart of New York City to young people and older people who feel that they really want to learn how to be comic book artists, and there's even a course in writing. And this is something new. It's very successful. He's had so many applications, and there's one class almost finishing. It's doing beautifully. For those of you who are interested, let me give you the address to contact. That's John Buscema, Department J, Box 394, East Setauket, New York 11733. That's not where the class is held. The class is held, as I say, in the heart of Manhattan, but East Setauket is where you can reach John. That's where he opens his mail. Big artists have different places where they open their mail and where they hang up their hat and where they read books, because they lead very glamorous lives. And now, back to rascally Roy Thomas.
I've never lived that name down. People keep asking me about that.
I think you probably hated me the first day that I wrote that.
You experimented around for a while when I first came. There was Rollickin' Roy and two or three others.
I like that too, I must admit.
I made up Roy the Boy to understand the man in one place myself, just for the heck of it. But yeah, Rascally Roy. People remember that, even though we don't use it quite as much. But I find myself using it.
Yeah.
Even. You know, it's a kind of a.
It is good. It's a funny thing about these nicknames. I started doing it years ago because I thought it was good promotion, and it was good for imagery to the readers, and also because I have such a lousy memory for names, it helped me. We had so many people, it helped me remember who was who. Let's see, at any rate, then you came to Marvel. And it was rather strange the way you got into the business. You didn't come to Marvel first, did you?
Well, you were writing all of the Marvel books, just about, except the couple that your brother, Larry wrote, the Westerns. So I figured, well, Marvel is a closed entity, and I never really applied for a job in comics anyway, but I was sending the fanzine around to people, and suddenly, just after I'd accepted a scholarship to do graduate work, when I was back in St. Louis, 2 days later, I got this offer to work for National Periodical as the assistant editor of Superman. And I worked for them for two whole weeks and so forth. Didn't like it a lot, and had wanted to, you probably don't even remember this, I had wanted to meet you because I admired your writing. Of course, I was interested in the artwork too, but the writing was the main thing.
I thought you were going to say, of course, what did I know then?
So, and I wrote you a letter asking why couldn't we get together for a drink sometime, and you ended up indirectly in the next day or two offering me a job about 10 minutes after we met.
It was easier and cheaper to offer you a job than to buy you a drink.
Yeah, I guess it was. I guess it was. And I wrote Millie the Model that weekend, and it's been working out okay ever since.
Was Millie the Model the one you started?
Well, it was actually Modeling with Millie, which was the second book. I went home and wrote that over the weekend, and you didn't like that one a lot. You liked the second one I did, the second one, yeah.
I think I wouldn't have liked anything at first, because I used to love Bill. I used to tell myself I'm the only guy who can write this.
You were probably right.
Yeah. But it's funny. You may not know this, but you walked in like 1 second after I was saying, "Please send me somebody who can take this load off our shoulders."
Well, nobody knew, because nobody knew that you were looking for anyone. Everybody thought you liked writing all these books all the time.
Well, I did, but
I mean that you had all the time. No one could understand. Everybody thought that the letterers were actually writing them, because nobody could possibly be editing a whole line of books and writing 200 or 300 pages a month. So we figured it was really all ghostwriting. At least a lot of people felt that you signed your name to a lot of things you didn't really do, and it was actually the letterer that was doing it all.
It is funny. People do think that of people in our business. They think, there must be somebody helping them. Now, let's get to the real heavy stuff. Roy Thomas.
Yeah.
I like to think that my name, for example, is associated with a strip like Spider-Man, or the Hulk or whatever. In your case, while your name is also associated with many strips, I would have to think that when anybody who thinks of comic books and thinks of Roy Thomas, after they've thought of Millie the Model, their next thing has to be Conan the Barbarian.
So it seems.
And I have to admit, this is one thing that I can take very little credit for. because it seems to me the first time you came to me and suggested doing Conan the Barbarian, my thought was, you know, who's interested in that except maybe Roy Thomas? You know, you said it's sword and sorcery, and I said to you, what sword and sorcery?
We're still arguing that one.
Yeah, I'm still not quite sure what it is, but I know it's been very successful. What made you decide that was what you wanted to try?
Well, basically, one thing that you forgotten, and I often do too, is that we were getting a lot of letters from readers who were aware that Conan the Barbarian was a series of books that was coming out in the late 60s in paperback form, and it sold 2 or 3 million copies with these beautiful covers by you know, Frank Frazetta, and these stories that were actually written for pulp magazines in the 30s. And I had never read one. I had bought one, I started one, put it aside, but it seemed as if the kind of thing that might just make it in comics, and we needed something different. You know, you can't do endless numbers of superheroes. And actually, I think you were about as, you know, enthusiastic about it as I was. It's just that, you know, we were not sure whether
I think I never thought it would be so good.
Oh, I didn't either. No.
I had been brainwashed by them, by the readers. I felt if they don't wear costumes and boots, they're not going to sell. You remember what happened with the Fantastic Four? In the beginning, we tried to tone down the costumes, and I got all this mail from readers. We love the book, it's great, everything is fine, but I'll never read another book if you don't give them costumes.
I think I wrote that one. One of those.
So you're the one who brainwashed me. I felt you have to have a superhero costume.
I did
and
too.
here's Conan, like Tarzan, sort of a loincloth. He did have little furry boots, as I
Off and
remember.
on, sandals, yeah.
As a matter of fact, I promised you I would try to remember about the painting, and this is a great lead-in. We even have a painting of a cover of Conan that Roy may want to talk about. Can you get that on the camera clearly enough? It's a really beautiful painting. Who did it, Roy? And what was the story?
The painting underneath it, it's really 2 paintings. The underdrawing was done by John Buscema, who does the book regularly. The finished painting over that was done by Boris Vallejo, who's a very talented newcomer in painting in recent years. And this is an illustration we did for one of our large dollar Conan magazines, and it's the most famous Conan scene from literature. I wish I could say I made this up, but I didn't. And it's of Conan. He was crucified and left to die on the desert by one of his enemies. And
I remember that story.
That vulture that you're seeing there is about to come down and try to peck out his eyes, thinking that he's, you know, dead or dying. And what he does at that stage is he bites the vulture's neck, breaks it while it's clawing against him and so forth, and kills it. You can't have a hero very much tougher than that, you know.
When you call him Conan the Barbarian, you're not or I should say when Robert Howard called him that, he wasn't kidding, huh?
No, he wasn't kidding.
Well, there is something about Conan. I guess he combines the primitive jungle excitement of Tarzan with a special savagery of his own, plus a great air of fantasy. There's a lot of fantasy in those stories. I see our time signal is being given. Roy, while you think of examples of the fantasy, all right, let me talk now about, let's see, we did this one. Someday we're going to have a big enough show that we have somebody else read the commercials. But anyway, here we go. I must admit I like doing the one for Super Snipe especially. So let's talk about the Super Snipe Bookshop. Now, as everybody who's into comics knows, Super Snipe is the bookstore for the fan and the collector. Located at 1617 2nd Avenue, New York, near the corner of 84th Street. It has over 500,000 back issues. It has early delivery of all the new comics, so you never need miss your new books. They sell original artwork. They buy original artwork. Super Snipe buys complete collections, and out of the goodness of their heart, to show how they care about you, they're open from 12 to 6, Monday to Saturday, although apparently they don't care about you on Wednesdays, because that's when Super Snipe is closed. That's the Super Snipe Bookstore, 1617 2nd Avenue, New York, near the corner of 84th Street, and if you desperately want to phone them immediately, it's 879-9628. And now, let's have one more cultural moment as we discuss the origins of Marvel Comics. Now, I don't care how you focus on me, but be sure that this is perfect, because this was the first in what promises to be a never-ending series of books telling how Marvel Comics got started, and also illustrating the stories and the introductions with really magnificent samples, magnificently colored and printed samples of our earliest strips. This became a bestseller within a few weeks and was followed shortly thereafter by Son of Origins of Marvel Comics. I might add that a third issue is going on sale in just a few months. It's not called Son-in-Law or Brother-in-Law. It's called Bring On the Bad Guys, telling all about the villains, but you'll hear about that later. At any rate, both The Origins of Marvel Comics and Son of Origins, through the benevolence of the publisher, Simon & Schuster, can now be yours if you follow these simple rules. Merely write to Simon & Schuster, Department MD, 630 Fifth Avenue, New York City, 120. Now that's The Origins of Marvel Comics, deluxe paperback at $6.95, cloth binding at $11.95. Or if you've already bought the Son of Origins, or if you, the Origins, or if you want to buy them both at the same time, Son of Origins, deluxe paperback, $6.95, cloth binding, $10.95, and you've had long enough to look at the address. I don't think I ought to repeat it. Okay? Now we go to Roy Thomas, and as soon as I get rid of these papers, and I think, Roy, we were just talking about the fantasy in Conan at that particular time. I never realized that sword and sorcery, which I thought of as just a guy with a sword hacking people to bits and so forth, I never realized there was so much magic and fantasy and so much of a fairy tale quality in these stories.
Well, the basic thing is that the man, Robert E. Howard, who invented the character, was trying to sell to this market Weird Tales, which was a magazine back in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And he liked to do this heroic adventure with people just hacking away with swords, but they wouldn't buy it. So in order to get them to buy it, he had to bring in monsters. They would fight, apes with human intelligence, or pterodactyl men, or evil wizards, mostly, things of this sort. And then they bought it, and it created a whole little genre of fantasy just because he was trying to make a buck, basically.
I never knew that. Right?
Yeah, he lived down in Texas, and he never even met another writer.
Yeah. Probably he wasn't able to be corrupted by others.
Probably.
Let me ask you, isn't there a lot of magic and enchantment in the stories also? There are witches and people who cast spells and that
There is. I try to
keep
keep
it just occasional?
No, I try to keep it down, though, to about one supernatural thing per issue for the most part, as a general rule.
I see.
Simply because otherwise, if everything is magical, the world doesn't seem real, and you've already got a kind of a strange medieval, ancient kind of mishmash
The world itself seems
because it's a fictitious
time.
time that is supposed to be before the fall of Atlantis, which never really, existed anyway.
I think that's great. In order for him to be very literal and very scholarly, and so that historians can follow it, he says, well, it happened before the fall of Atlantis, as though everybody knows exactly what day Atlantis fell, if there indeed was.
10,000 BC.
Yeah, that is funny.
You can look it up in your history books there.
The funny thing is, if I had realized there was as much fantasy in Conan, I would have been more enthusiastic about it, because I've learned, as far as our readers are concerned, I think the reason Marvel comic superheroes are so popular, I am convinced it's the element of fantasy that all the stories contain. So now I feel better. I feel that I wasn't really that wrong.
Well, you mean that even though it's up to about 70 issues now, you're not going to cancel it this
I'm beginning to think that we've got a winner there.
Maybe so.
He may be another Howard the Duck.
Maybe so.
Someday we may devote a show to Howard the Duck, but I want to keep you guessing if you don't know what that is.
Wait till it gets up to 70 issues.
Okay,
right?
That's right. After he's proven himself, right?
Right.
Let me ask you something. We had other sword and sorcery characters. We had King Kull, or Kull the King.
He was many things.
Right.
Yeah, many names.
Why do you think Conan was more popular with our readers than all these others, which in many ways were rather similar? Do you have a theory for that?
Well, nothing to go into, too briefly, except that Conan is just a better character. It's like, why is Spider-Man better than Daredevil? Good as a character as Daredevil is, Spider-Man's a better one. Kull is an older character than Conan. You probably don't know that.
Yeah. No, I didn't.
Kull was created by the same man and created before Conan, and then
Roy Howard. Robert Howard.
Yeah,
Robert.
Right, I'm right.
I have Roy on the brain.
But anyway, so they're very similar. I think one of the problems is that Kull was emphasized as being a king, and I think it's rather dull to be a king. You probably had that trouble when you wrote The Submariner. I know I always did. When you've got a guy who's a king or even a prince that sits on a throne, it's very difficult to make the reader feel any empathy with him. In fact,
very hard to relate to a king.
The Kull book has become very popular, which is why we've recently brought it back, and it's mainly because we've dethroned him, and he's now wandering around the world killing people and fighting monsters, trying to get back his throne.
Do you think some of this has to do with the syndrome that seems to be popular today, where somebody like Columbo is popular? In the old days, Humphrey Bogart was popular, and the rough, rough and tumble characters, certainly the readers of adventure seem to like somebody like that, rather than somebody who's very wealthy and who's very regal. I think people who like adventure probably like to read about a tough slob who's kind of unpredictable and is given to some sort of unexpected violence.
And he's realistic because he's greedy to a certain extent. He's noble, and you have to have a character be noble. You know, you can't just say, well, he's just in it for the money alone, because nobody's interested in that. But over this nobility, he wants to get paid for anything that he does. He's more interested in women than his horse, unlike, say, cowboy heroes.
Sounds like you and me.
Exactly like you and me. You know?
Maybe that's why our own superheroes were popular after a while, like Spider-Man, because when you think about it, and the Fantastic Four, these were characters who also worried about money. You know, the old superheroes, you never had the feeling they had a bill to pay or anything, you know?
Right.
They'd worry about, do the girls like them, instead of girls always chasing them around.
Right.
So I was asleep at the switch. I should have realized the similarities sooner. What happened was, I guess I looked at it in a shallow way. I saw a guy wearing a loincloth, and I said to myself, well, why do the readers who like Spider-Man, like Conan, listening to you talk, there's probably much more of a similarity than I thought there was.
Is underneath, yes. Yeah. That's why it fit in so nicely.
Yeah. Well, I always said you always taught me a lot while you were there.
Yeah, sure.
All right, let me look at the security blanket and see what I've missed. Hey, Roy, one thing that I think is important, and usually I ask this of people at the end of the show. There's never enough time to really answer it, but so many young people want to write for comics. And whenever I'm lecturing in a school or somewhere, the one question they ask is, hey, Stan, how do I get into comics? How do I become a writer? It's difficult as you can imagine, and it's hard to explain. Do you want to just take it easy and explain, if you were a young person now who wanted to write comics, what are the steps, if there are any?
Well, I was asked this question a lot most recently at the Marvel convention, and what I had to tell them is that I'm not a good person to ask it, because I never applied for a job, really, in comics. I just sort of drifted into it. But one of the best steps, of course, is a good general education in writing, drawing, whatever you happen to want to get into, of course. The more you know, the more you have to give the job when you finally get into it. That's one thing. But as far as the direct steps, I think that the best thing to do is to try to get training through these amateur magazines like I did, the fanzines, which are magazines published by fans, primarily for fans, because this is a good way to have your artwork, your writing, and it'll be published, it'll be seen by people, you may even build a following and so forth, and the next thing you know, you walk in, and even the professionals may know who you are. Yeah. Like, I was a fan, and yet you knew vaguely who I was, because I'd written these articles for fan magazines. You bombarded
us with that fanzine for years.
I just did 3 issues.
But basically, it really isn't a case of a guy just knocking on the door and walking in and saying, I'd like to be a writer.
Also, with art or with writing, I think a very important thing is, don't spend all your time imitating comic book writing. Don't spend all your time imitating drawing. In other words,
that's the thing.
Sure, look at for art. Look at Romita, Kirby, Buscema, all these guys. For writing, look at the stuff that you and I and a lot of other writers you like have done. But also remember that all we're doing is reflecting what we've read and what we've seen. So therefore, learn as much as you can. If you're an artist, learn about anatomy.
Perfect.
If you're a writer, read as much as you possibly can, fiction and non-fiction.
As a writer, it's also a good idea, if possible, as Roy said, with fanzines, but even in other ways, to build a reputation as a professional writer in another field. Sell stories to other magazines, write a play, write a movie or something, because it's tough to evaluate a person's ability unless we see things he's done. And I'm really glad you covered those points. Now we have one more commercial, which is of paramount importance. And all I have to do, while I'm looking for it, let me show the album cover. It's the Spider-Man album, Rock Reflections of a Superhero. Not a kiddie album, a real rock album with pretty good music. Pretty exciting music, I might say. And as an added kick, I have been told, and it says on the back of the cover, that the Incredible Hulk is on drums. Spider-Man is apparently, he's doing something crazy there. Trumpet is the mighty Thor, Black Panther on electric guitar, and so forth. You can't get an album like that anywhere. And let me tell you how to get your Rock Reflections of a Superhero starring Spider-Man. Simply send to Superhero Merchandise, Post Office Box 777, Dover, New Jersey. That's 07801. Now, I read it slowly, write it down because I may not repeat it. And it's a record album, $737. The cassette and the 8-track tape is $837. Both those amounts include postage and handling. That's all you pay. Be sure to print your name and address, city, state, zip code, and age very clearly, and allow 4 weeks for delivery. We're going to be waiting to hear from you now. And now, back to Roy Thomas. Roy, we just have a minute or so to wrap up. Let me ask you this. Do you have any feelings about the future of comics? We know where we are today. Is it a field that's going to stay the same? Are people going to lose interest? Do you think it'll grow? Where do you think
I think the interest in comics is probably in many ways at an all-time high, especially among the older age groups, from the late teens on up through the 20s and 30s and even older, as more and more people mature who grew up, like myself, reading comic books. But the problem is that, you know, as you know better than I do, even printing costs and things have grown up so much that the regular 32-page comic, I think, is increasingly untenable. And I think that the directions you're going with the books, the expensive books, both the reprints and eventually original material and things of this sort, this is the real answer, is a more expensive and therefore even higher quality product in printing and probably in the amount of time and work we can put into it. And that's what I really want to see comics become, to the point where it's sold in bookstores and it's completely legitimatized. We already know that the material is at least reasonably good and has a lot of potential. We just have to convince the rest of the world about it. And we're doing that, I think, slowly and surely. And
we're trying.
Yeah, and Marvel Comics, as you know, and I say this as a person who came in 4 years after it started, you know, has probably had more to do with that than anything else.
Well, I too would hope that the day will come when our books are sold in hardcover editions and nobody would think there's anything strange or unusual about it. And as for you, you're thinking of moving to the coast, I understand, and you'll still be writing for us, of course, and hopping back and forth and getting your fingers in movie writing and so forth. Roy, I want to take this opportunity to wish you all the luck in the world. Don't you dare leave us.
No.
I don't mind you being a few thousand miles away. Don't you dare leave us. And the next time you come back to the city, you have to come and visit the old soapbox again and tell us what's happening out on the coast.
Okay, right.
Thanks so much for coming,
Thank you
Roy.
for having me.
Really a pleasure.
Bye.
As a matter of fact, now that we've done the official ending, I never know when the show really ends. We'll keep talking, and they can cut us off whenever they want.
Oh, that happens to me all the time.
When are you going to leave for the coast?
Oh, not till the summer sometime. I just wanted to change the scene for a year or two. It seemed kind of a nice idea.